The morning they dragged Wilhelmina Doyle into the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, her wrists were bound with rope that had already bitten red grooves into her skin, and not a single person on the main street paused long enough to look her in the eye. She had been riding with the Cassidy gang for 11 months, though riding with was a generous way to describe it. Swept up was closer to the truth. Coerced was even closer. But the law did not make fine distinctions, and Deputy Marshal Hector Vane, who had her by the rope's end like she was livestock, was not a man given to nuance. He was a thick-necked man with a waxed mustache and small eyes the color of dirty creek water, and he announced her arrival to the town with the kind of theatrical satisfaction that suggested he had been practicing the moment in his mirror. "Wilhelmina Doyle," he said, loud enough to turn heads from the barber shop and the general store and the saloon. "Accessory to 4 bank robberies, 1 stage holdup, and the attempted murder of a federal tax collector. She'll hang before the month is out, or I'm not Hector Vane." Mina, which was what she had been called since she was old enough to have an opinion about her own name, stood straight and did not cry. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and sharp-featured, with a jaw that her mother had called stubborn and her father had called determined. She had learned the hard way that the difference between those two words depended entirely on who was speaking them, and whether or not you agreed with what they were telling you to do. She had not agreed with most of what Eli Cassidy had told her to do. That was the problem with being the younger sister of a man who owed Cassidy money. When Cassidy came to collect and your brother could not pay, you became the collateral. Mina had spent 11 months cooking for men she despised, watching crimes she could not stop, and keeping her head down low enough that no one shot it off. She had not fired a weapon. She had not held a horse. She had not counted money or planned a route or done a single thing that the law would call criminal, save for the simple fact of being present, which, in the eyes of Hector Vane, was crime enough. The jail in Caldwell was a single room attached to the back of the marshal's office, with 2 cells separated by iron bars, and a window too small to let in enough air to make the August heat bearable. Mina was put in the left cell, and the door was locked with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence she had not finished writing. She sat on the cot and she thought about her brother Thomas, who was dead now, had been dead since February, when a fever took him in a mining camp outside Dodge City, and she thought about her mother in Missouri, who did not know where her daughter was, and she thought about all the small, ordinary things she had wanted from her life that had somehow never arrived. A house. A garden, work that was honest, someone to sit across from at supper who was worth sitting across from. She did not let herself cry until the lamp was turned down and she was certain no one was watching. Then she cried quietly with discipline, the way she did everything that mattered. 3 days passed. Vane brought her meals that were barely worth the name. A lawyer came from Wichita, appointed by the court, not chosen by her, and he was a young man with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had drawn the short straw. He told her the charge list was serious. He told her the judge who would hear the case had a reputation for severity. He told her, apologetically, that her options were limited. "The territorial prosecutor may be willing to offer a reduced sentence in exchange for information," he said, not looking at her directly. "Specifically, the whereabouts of Eli Cassidy. If you know where he operates out of, where he takes the gang between jobs, there is a possibility." "I don't know," Mina said. This was not entirely true. She knew the general territory, the canyon system west of Cimarron, near the New Mexico border. But she had learned enough about Eli Cassidy to know that speaking his name to men like Hector Vane had consequences that came in the night and did not announce themselves beforehand. So she said she didn't know, and the lawyer looked at his ink-stained fingers, and the conversation ended. On the 4th day, she was moved. No explanation was given. Vane simply appeared at her cell before dawn, with 2 men she had not seen before, and they put her on a horse with her wrists tied to the saddle horn and rode north through the gray pre-light. The prairie stretched out in every direction like something God had abandoned mid-thought, grass and sky, and the occasional dark smear of cottonwood trees along a creek line. Mina rode and did not ask where they were going, because she had learned that asking questions of men like Vane produced answers that were either lies or threats, and she was tired of both. They were 2 hours out of Caldwell when it happened. The road, such as it was, a rutted double track across the short grass, bent around a low rise, and on the other side of that rise, the lead horse of Vane's party shied hard at something in the brush. Vane shouted. One of the other men grabbed for his rifle. And in that moment of confusion, with horses spinning and cursing, and the whole party falling into the disorganized scramble that panicked horses create, the rope attaching Mina's wrists to the saddle horn went slack, because the saddle horn broke clean off a saddle that had been poorly maintained. And Mina, who had been raised on a farm in Missouri and had been riding horses before she could read, kicked her mount and ran. She ran south first, then cut east when the terrain suggested it, and she was off the road and into a shallow creek drainage before Vane had his horse under control. She could hear him shouting behind her, but the brush was thick and the morning was still gray, and she pushed the horse hard through the creek bottom, water spraying, branches slapping, until the shouting faded and then stopped entirely. She did not stop riding for another hour. When she finally pulled the horse up, she was deep in a stretch of country she did not recognize, with her wrists still bound by the shortened rope, no weapon, no water, no food, and the August sun beginning to climb in earnest. She worked at the knot with her teeth, which was slow and painful and eventually successful, and then she sat with her freed hands in her lap and tried to think clearly about what to do next. Running from a federal marshal was a new charge on top of the existing ones. She understood that. She also understood that if she turned herself back around and rode into Caldwell, the mood would be considerably less favorable than it had been 3 days ago. Vane was not a forgiving man. She did not think the judge would be either. She decided to keep going east. She had a horse, and horses needed water, so she followed the drainage and hoped it led somewhere useful. It led, eventually, to a homestead. It was a modest place, a main house built from limestone blocks, a barn in slightly better repair than the house, a kitchen garden along the south wall, and a windmill that was turning slowly in what little breeze existed. Mina pulled up at the edge of the property and considered it. Smoke from the chimney. A good sign. She rode forward. The man who came out of the barn when he heard her approach was tall, which she noticed first because he occupied space in a particular way, not aggressive, not puffed up, just present, like a tree that had been there a long time and had no need to announce itself. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw covered in several days of dark beard, and he wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and boots that had seen considerable use. He stopped when he saw her and looked at her with the kind of even, unhurried attention that was different from staring. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some water." "For the horse mostly. I am fine." He looked at her wrists, where the rope burns were visible and recent, and then he looked at her face, and she could see him reading the situation with a quiet, practiced intelligence that suggested he was not a man who missed much. "Come on," he said, and turned and walked toward the well. He pumped water into a trough and let her horse drink, and then he pumped more into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it. The water was cold and tasted of minerals, and it was the best thing she had put in her mouth in 4 days. "Ralph Trask," he said. "Mina," she said, and hesitated, and then said the whole of it because she was tired of small evasions. "Wilhelmina Doyle." He nodded, as though the name confirmed something he had already suspected, or as though names in general were information he filed away without reaction. He said, "You look like you could use some breakfast." She wanted to say she was fine again, because accepting help from strangers was a habit she had learned to be careful about. But she was very hungry and he was very calm, and something in the way he had simply walked her to the well without interrogating her first made her say, "Yes, thank you, I could." The inside of the house was spare but clean. A stone fireplace, a plain table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised her, a rifle above the door. He made eggs and cornbread and coffee, and he did it with the efficiency of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time, and she sat at the table and watched the morning come fully through the window and felt something in her chest loosen very slightly. He ate across from her without pressing her to talk, which was a quality she had almost forgotten people could possess. When she had eaten, she said, "I should tell you who I am, properly. You may have heard of me or may hear of me soon. I was riding with the Cassidy gang, not by choice, and I was arrested 4 days ago in Caldwell, and I escaped this morning when a saddle broke, which was not my plan. I am not a criminal, though I understand that the law does not see it that way. I am telling you this because you fed me and I think you deserve to know." Ralph Trask looked at her across the table for a long moment. He had brown eyes that were warm without being soft. There was a steadiness behind them that she found, to her own surprise, comforting rather than intimidating. "How long were you with Cassidy?" he said. 11 months. Did you ever fire a weapon at anyone?" "No." "Did you participate in the robberies?" "I cooked the meals and kept myself as small as possible." He nodded slowly. "Your brother owed him money," he said. It was not a question, which was remarkable because she had not told him about Thomas. She stared at him. "How did you know that?" "I've dealt with Eli Cassidy before. He's had a particular method of acquiring women to run his camp for the last several years. I've encountered the situation twice." He paused, and something moved briefly across his face that was not quite anger but was related to it. "Twice I wasn't able to help." There was a history in that sentence that she did not press him on, because it was clearly heavy and he had offered it voluntarily, which meant he had measured it and decided she could hold it. "I don't know what to do next," she said honestly. "I can't go back to Caldwell. I can't go home to Missouri because that's the first place they'll look. I have a horse and not much else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a spare room. You can stay here while you work out what comes next. I won't pretend that's without risk for both of us, but it seems preferable to the alternatives." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that for someone you met an hour ago?" He thought about it. She was learning, a man who thought before he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been. "Because the situation you're describing isn't fair," he said. "And because I have some experience with things that aren't fair, and I'd rather do something about it when I can." She stayed. The spare room was small and had a cot and a window that looked out over the prairie to the east, and the first night she lay in it and stared at the ceiling and listened to the coyotes and the windmill and the total, enormous silence of the Kansas grassland, and she felt something she had not felt in 11 months, which was the possibility that things might eventually be different. In the days that followed, she learned about Ralph Trask in the way you learn about people when you live alongside them. Incrementally, in the details of how they spend their time. He ran the homestead alone, had for 3 years, since the death of his wife in a difficult childbirth that had taken both her and the child with her. His name was on the deed to 320 acres, which he ran as a cattle operation on a small scale, 60 head, which he managed mostly by himself with occasional hired help during branding and roundup. He was 32 years old. He had come west from Ohio in 1874 and had put his roots in Kansas soil with the deliberate, patient intention of a man who wanted something permanent. He was not talkative, but he was not silent either. There was a middle ground he occupied naturally, where words were used when they served a purpose and silence was not uncomfortable. She found herself watching him at work fixing fence, moving cattle, repairing the windmill with a wrench and a long patience, and noticing the competence with which he did everything, which was not showy but was absolute. She began, without quite deciding to, making herself useful. She knew about gardens, so she worked in the kitchen garden. She was a good cook, not just the plain camp cooking she had done for the Cassidy gang, but real cooking, with seasoning and care, the kind her mother had taught her in Missouri. She repaired some things in the house that had been neglected: a loose shutter, a door that hung crooked, small things that accumulated into comfort. He noticed, but he did not make a fuss of it. He said one evening over supper, "You didn't have to do all that." And she said, "I know. I wanted to." And he looked at her in that steady, measuring way he had, and then he said, "Thank you," with a sincerity that was entirely without performance. A week in, she found his books on the shelf and asked about them. He had maybe 20 volumes, Shakespeare, a history of the Roman Republic, 2 novels by Dickens, a surveying manual, a Bible that looked well read, and several others. He said, somewhat self-consciously, that he had always liked reading, that it was one of the few things he had insisted on bringing west when most people told him to leave the books and bring practical things instead. She said without thinking, "I think books are practical things." He looked at her with something that shifted slightly in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though she had said something he had been thinking for a long time. "Yes," he said. "I've always thought so too." After that they talked more. In the evenings, after the work was done and the heat of the day had broken into something almost tolerable, they would sit on the porch, him in the chair, her on the step, and talk about the books, or about the cattle, or about Missouri and Ohio, and the different ways the 2 states produce people. She told him about her mother, who was a practical woman with a tender core that she hid under a talent for organization. He told her about his father, who had been a school teacher, and who had thought his son was making a mistake going west, and who had been wrong about most of it, though Ralph said he'd never had the chance to tell him so because his father had died in 1878. "Do you regret coming west?" she asked him one evening. He thought about it. The sky was doing its extravagant prairie sunset business, all orange and pink and purple stacked up on the horizon, and the cattle were distant shadows and the windmill was clicking. "No," he said. "Even the hard parts. I think the hard parts are what this place requires of you, and there's something clarifying about that. You find out what you're made of." She thought about what she had found out about herself in the last 11 months. She said, "I found out I can endure more than I thought." "That's not a small thing," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I'd rather not have needed to discover it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you want before all of it, before Cassidy?" She considered. "Something quiet," she said. "I wanted something honest and quiet, work I could be proud of, and a place that felt like mine and people worth having." She paused. "Very simple things when you say them out loud." "Simple things are usually the hardest to find," he said. She looked at him in the failing light. He was looking at the horizon, his profile steady against the brilliant sky, and she thought that he was a good man in the plain, deep sense of the word. Not a man performing goodness, not a man angling for the credit of it, just a man who lived by a code he had arrived at honestly and did not apologize for. She looked away before he could catch her staring. 2 weeks passed. She did not go into town. He went once, to the feed merchant, and he told her he had heard that Hector Vane had come through asking questions but had moved on south. She felt the fear move through her and subside. He brought her back a packet of letters from his post box, and one of them was for her name, in her mother's handwriting, sent to the Caldwell post office, and forwarded without explanation to a dozen places before someone had written Ralph Trask's name on the envelope and sent it here, which neither of them could explain, but there it was. She held the letter for a long time before she opened it. Her mother's letters always made her feel 17 again, which was not an entirely comfortable feeling, but it was a real one. Her mother wrote that she had heard news of Mina's arrest from a man passing through and had been praying every day since. She wrote that Thomas dying had been a grief she would carry forever. She wrote that she wanted Mina to come home if she ever could. Mina put the letter down and pressed her palms flat on the table and took several slow breaths. Ralph was across the room and she had not heard him come in, but he was there and he said quietly, "Bad news." "No," she said with some difficulty. "Good news. My mother wants me home. She stopped. "Miss her," he said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. He did not touch her, which was the right instinct, and he did not offer any of the hollow comforts that people offered when they did not know what to say. He simply sat with her in the difficulty of it, which was more useful than most words. "We'll find a way to fix your situation," he said, "properly, not just running." She looked at him. "The law is not generally interested in the particulars of how someone came to be in a gang. Some judges are, and there are other ways." He said it with a certainty that suggested he had already been thinking about it, had been thinking about it for some time, and had not mentioned it because he had not wanted to raise her hope before he had something concrete. "I know a lawyer in Wichita. A real one, not whatever they handed you in Caldwell. His name is Marcus Webb, and he has had some success with cases where coercion was a factor. I'd like to write to him." She stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out with more weight than she had intended, and he heard it. He was the kind of person who heard the weight under words. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. And because he stopped, and she had the sense of something being considered and then set aside for later. "Because it's the right thing to do." She did not press the part he had stopped himself from saying. She let it rest. He wrote to Marcus Webb the following morning, and she watched him write the letter with the care of someone who chose every word deliberately, and she found herself wanting to know what the incomplete sentence had been going to say. Because it's the right thing to do, and because. The third week brought trouble. It came in the form of two riders who appeared at the edge of the property on a Tuesday morning while Ralph was in the far pasture and Mina was in the kitchen garden. She saw them before they saw her, which gave her the advantage of a moment's observation. One was a young man she did not recognize, early 20s, sandy-haired, riding a paint horse. The other was Clem Pryor, who had ridden with the Cassidy gang for the 2 years before Mina had been brought in, and who had a memory for faces like a steel trap and an instinct for loyalty that ran entirely to whoever paid him best. She went still behind the bean rows and made herself small and hoped the garden's modest height was enough. It was not. Clem Pryor pulled up near the well and looked around, and then his gaze came to the garden and stopped. She saw the recognition happen in his face, the slight widening of the eyes, the way his head tilted. "Well," he said, mainly to himself. She straightened. There was no point in hiding once you had been seen. She had learned that lesson at some cost. She said, "Clem." "Mina Doyle," he said. He had a slow, rolling way of speaking that always made her think of something biding its time. "Cassidy's been looking for you. I'm not with Cassidy anymore. I think Cassidy might feel differently about that." The young man on the paint horse was watching the exchange with wary eyes, and she could tell he was not sure what Clem was about to do, which meant Clem had not told him who they were looking for or why, which meant this was either coincidence or Clem was operating independently. Neither option was comfortable. "What does Cassidy want with me?" she said. "You know where the canyon is," Clem said. "The winter camp. He's concerned you might have shared that information." "I haven't shared it with anyone." "He'd like your word on that, in person." "Then Cassidy can ride out here himself," she said, and even as she said it she heard how absurd it was. She was a woman alone in a garden, and Clem Pryor outweighed her by 70 pounds and had a revolver on his hip. But she was not alone. She had not heard Ralph come up behind her, but he was there. She became aware of him by the slight change in Clem's expression, and she turned to see Ralph standing at the edge of the garden, his rifle held in both hands in a way that was not aggressive but was entirely unambiguous. "These men bothering you," he said. His voice was even the same tone he used to discuss cattle or weather, but there was something under it that was absolutely certain, and Clem Pryor, who had survived in his profession by reading men accurately, went very still. "Just passing through," Clem said after a moment. "You're on private land," Ralph said. "The road is that way." He moved his head slightly north, indicating the direction without pointing the rifle, which was a distinction she appreciated. Clem looked at Mina. Something moved across his face that she could not fully read: calculation, maybe, or some private decision being made. He said, "I'll tell Cassidy I didn't find you." She did not say thank you, because owing Clem Pryor anything was not a position she wanted to be in. She nodded, once. Clem and the sandy-haired young man rode north. Ralph watched them go until they were out of sight, and then he lowered the rifle and turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were closer than they usually stood, and she could see the residue of something in his expression that was not quite anger but was something fierce and protective that he was quietly putting away. "We need to move faster with Webb," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then turned and went back toward the barn, and she stood in the garden and felt her heart beating at a speed that had nothing to do with fear. That evening she found herself unable to settle. She walked the perimeter of the property in the cooling dark, watching the stars come out over the prairie, thinking about Cassidy, and about Clem Pryor's decision to say he hadn't found her, and about whether it would hold. She had almost circled back to the house when she found Ralph at the windmill, one hand on the tower's base looking east. "Can't sleep either," she said. "No," he glanced at her. "You're thinking about Cassidy." "Yes, and about what Clem said, that I know where the canyon is. Cassidy will stay worried about that. He'll send someone else." Ralph was quiet for a moment, working something through. "What if that information were used the right way?" he said. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "What if you brought it to someone who could actually do something with it? The U.S. Marshal's office, not Vane, but the office proper in Wichita. Not as a trade for your freedom, but as testimony through a proper legal channel. Webb could manage it. If you're a witness rather than a fugitive, the whole nature of your situation changes." She was quiet. The idea was not simple. "Cassidy would know it was me." "Cassidy is going to keep looking for you regardless. The question is whether you're running permanently or whether you end it. It's a considerable risk." "Yes," he agreed. He turned to look at her fully, and in the starlight his face was serious and sure. "I won't tell you what to do. I'm telling you I'll help you whatever you decide, but I think you're strong enough for the harder path." Something happened in her chest at that, a loosening, a warmth. Not because he had told her she was strong, but because he had said it without sentimentality, as a statement of observed fact, as though her strength were simply something he had noticed the way he noticed when the wind was coming from the south. "Let me think about it," she said. He nodded. "Take all the time you need." But the time she needed was only one night. By morning she knew, with the calm certainty of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves about what they actually want, that she was done running. She told him at breakfast, and something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to relief, and he said, "All right. I'll ride to Wichita tomorrow." She said, "I'll ride with you." He looked at her with that even, measuring gaze. "That's more dangerous." "Yes," she said, "but hiding here is not a permanent solution, and I've been hiding long enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And then he said, with a careful deliberateness that suggested the words had been waiting for the right moment, "I'm glad you're here, Mina. I want you to know that. Whatever happens next, I'm glad you ended up at this well." She looked at her coffee cup, because looking at him directly when he said things like that was more complicated than looking at her coffee cup. "I'm glad too," she said, which was the truest and most insufficient thing she could have said. They rode out the following morning before first light, both of them armed, she with a small pistol he had given her without ceremony, showing her how to use it with patient, practical instruction, and they made good time north and east toward Wichita, stopping at midday beside a creek where the cottonwoods gave shade and the horses could drink. They ate hardtack and dried beef, and she watched a kingfisher work the creek, while Ralph studied the map he had folded in his shirt pocket. The day was hot, but there was a breeze in the cottonwoods, and the light coming through the leaves was the particular green gold of summer afternoon, and she thought that this moment, this specific, ordinary moment, sitting on a creek bank with a man she had known for 3 weeks, was as close to what she had wanted as anything she could remember. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "You said you dealt with Cassidy before, that you'd seen the situation twice and couldn't help." She paused. "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment, folding the map. "The first woman was a widow from Nebraska. Her land adjoined one of Cassidy's known territories. He used her place as a relay station for 3 months' horses' supplies. She had no choice. When the law found out, they took her to trial and convicted her. She lost the land. I gave testimony that she'd had no choice and it didn't matter. He paused. The second was a girl from Abilene, barely 20. By the time I found out she was in trouble, she had already been moved somewhere I couldn't find her. He said it plainly, but she could hear under it the cost of those 2 failures, the way they sat in him, waited. "None of that was your fault," she said. "I know that," he said. "Knowing it doesn't entirely fix it." She understood that. Thomas's death had not been her fault either, and she knew that too, and knowing it was not the same as being done with it. "We'll do better this time," she said. He looked at her with something that was warm and complicated and certain. "Yes," he said, "we will." They reached Wichita the following afternoon and went directly to Marcus Webb's office on 2nd Street. Webb was a compact, energetic man in his mid-40s with reading glasses and a very organized desk, and the air of someone who had seen most of the ways the law could be bent, and had developed strong opinions about straightening it back out. He shook Ralph's hand and then Mina's, and he listened to her account of the past 11 months with his elbows on the desk and his fingers laced together and his full, careful attention. When she was done, he said, "And you can provide specific information about Eli Cassidy's location and operation." "The winter camp in the canyon system west of Cimarron," she said. "I can describe the approach and the layout. I spent 2 weeks there. I know the routines." Webb nodded slowly. He looked at Ralph. "She needs to go through the U.S. Marshal's office, not Vane's office. I have a contact there, a marshal by the name of Cooper, who is both honest and politically astute enough to know that prosecuting coerced camp followers while Cassidy walks free is not a good use of anyone's resources. He'll listen." "How long will it take?" Ralph said. "Arranging a meeting with Cooper. 3 days, maybe 4. In the meantime, I can get her situation reviewed formally. The question of the escape charge is manageable. Courts have been lenient about flight from custody when the underlying charges were questionable. It'll take some work, but it's manageable." He looked at Mina. "Miss Doyle, I want to be honest with you. There will be a process. It won't be swift. But I believe we have a strong case, and I believe you will be a credible witness." She said, "What do I do in the meantime?" "Stay in Wichita," he said. "I'll arrange a room. Don't use your full name in public. Don't go out at night alone." He paused. "And trust me, I've won harder cases than this." Ralph said, "I'll stay in Wichita too." Webb looked at him, then at Mina, and there was a small, professional discretion in his expression that suggested he was not going to comment on the nature of their arrangement. "Fine," he said. "The Drovers Inn on Douglas Avenue is a decent place. Quiet." They took 2 rooms at the Drovers Inn. That first evening, Mina sat on the edge of her bed and listened to Wichita doing its evening business. The sound of a piano from somewhere down the street, horses, voices, the creak of the building, and felt the immensity of what she had set in motion. She was about to give information about Eli Cassidy to a federal marshal. Whatever happened after that was irrevocable. There was a knock at her door. She said, "Come in," and it was Ralph, who stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and asked if she had eaten, and she said no, and he said there was a decent dining room downstairs. At supper they talked about everything except what was coming, which was a mutual and unspoken courtesy that she appreciated. They talked about a novel she had found in the inn's small reading parlor, a copy of Wilkie Collins, worn and much-read, and about whether Wichita in 1882 was a different town than it had been during the cattle drive years, when it had been considerably more chaotic, and about a dog that had been sitting outside the dining room window watching them eat with the focused intensity of someone who had attended many such meals and had learned that patience was eventually rewarded. Ralph said, "What did you want to do before everything, before Cassidy, before all of it? What did you want your life to be?" She had answered a version of this question on the porch weeks ago, but this felt more specific somehow, and she answered it more specifically. "I wanted to teach," she said. "I had 2 years of normal school in Missouri. I wanted to find a small town that needed a school teacher and settle there and be useful in that particular way." She paused. "I liked the idea of it, not just the teaching itself, but the continuity of it. You teach a child, and what you give them stays with them, and they carry it forward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's no school in the county where my homestead is. The nearest is 12 miles. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else about it, but the sentence sat between them in the candlelight with considerable significance, and she felt it in the way you feel the first warmth of a fire when you have been cold for a long time. They said good night at the top of the stairs with a slight, shy awkwardness that was entirely unlike the easy manner they had developed on the homestead, and she thought that the awkwardness was its own kind of information, that when you started being careful with someone, it meant you had started to care about what they thought. 3 days later, Marcus Webb arranged the meeting with Marshal Samuel Cooper. Cooper was a weathered, gray-haired man who wore his authority with the comfort of someone who had had it for long enough not to think about it. He met them in Webb's office, and he shook Mina's hand and looked at her directly, and she had the sense that he was a man who had developed, over decades, an accurate read of people and was applying it now. She told him everything. The complete account, her brother's debt, the coercion, the 11 months, the specific details of the canyon camp. She told it plainly and without sentiment, and without excusing herself for the things she wished she had done differently, because honest testimony meant telling the whole truth and not arranging it for your own benefit. Cooper listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The canyon system west of Cimarron," he said. "Two approaches," she said. "The south trail is the one they use for supplies. It's the easier gradient. The north approach is shorter but comes in high and exposed. There are typically 8 to 12 men in camp. Cassidy is almost always there from October through March." "October's 6 weeks out," Cooper said. "Yes." He looked at Ralph, then at Webb, then back at Mina. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Doyle. My assessment is that the charges against you are marginal, and the value of what you're providing is not. What I can do is make a formal recommendation to the prosecutor's office for complete dismissal of charges on the basis of your cooperation and the quality of your testimony." He paused. "That is a process that will take some weeks. In the meantime, I need you to remain in Kansas." "I understand," she said. "Mr. Webb will keep you informed, and I want a written deposition, detailed, dated, signed within the week." "She'll have it," Webb said. Cooper stood. He shook hands all around, and then paused at the door and looked at Mina with the evaluating steadiness of a man who dealt in facts. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "I know that doesn't make it easier." "No," she said, "but I've learned that doing the right thing is usually not the easiest thing, and that's not an argument against doing it." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been approval. Then he went. She let out a long, slow breath. Ralph was beside her, not touching, just present in that way he had, and she felt his presence the way you feel a solid wall when you have been standing in wind. The weeks in Wichita were a strange, suspended time, neither the old life nor the new one, but a threshold between them. She wrote the deposition with Webb, carefully and precisely, and she read it through 4 times to make sure every word was accurate and defensible. She walked through the town in the mornings, careful and deliberate, wearing a plain calico dress she had bought from a dry goods store with the small amount of money Ralph had insisted on lending her. She was not reckless, but she was not invisible either. She was done with being invisible. Ralph stayed. He had arranged for a neighboring rancher to look after his cattle, and he stayed, which was a choice that had its own meaning and that she thought about in the evenings when she was alone. They spent most of their free time together, because it was natural by now, and because the city, with its noise and its crowds, made the familiar ease between them feel like something they both needed. They walked along the Arkansas River in the evenings. They ate at the same table in the dining room and talked for hours. One afternoon, they found a bookshop on Main Street and spent an entire afternoon in it, which Ralph called the best afternoon he had had in Wichita. In the bookshop, she reached for a volume on the top shelf at the same moment he did, and their hands arrived at the same book at the same time, and they both laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, properly, without reserve, and it was a good laugh, warm and genuine and a little surprised at itself. She said, "You take it." He said, "You were here first." "I don't know if that's true." "It's true," he said, and handed her the book, and his hand brushed hers, and neither of them moved away immediately. The book was a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass, a recent edition. She bought it. That evening, on the inn's small front porch, she read some of it aloud to him because he asked, and she did not mind. And the summer evening was warm and the street was quieting, and his face in the lantern light was relaxed in a way she had learned to read as contentment. She read the lines about the open road, about going where the road takes you and belonging to no one but yourself, and he was very still while she read. When she stopped, he said, quietly, "What made you choose that one?" She thought about it. "I think because for a long time I didn't feel like I had any road of my own," she said. "I was always on someone else's, and I like the idea that the road can be yours." He was quiet for a moment. The lantern moved slightly in the breeze. He said, "I want to say something, and I hope you'll forgive me if the timing is wrong." She looked at him. Her heart did something it had been doing with increasing frequency lately, which was move at a different speed than usual. "In the time you've been here," he said carefully, "you've changed things, at the homestead and more than that. I have been alone for 3 years, and I had made my peace with it, or I thought I had. But I think I was just very well acquainted with emptiness, without realizing that that wasn't the same thing as being at peace." He stopped, and the deliberateness of his phrasing made it clear this was not something he was improvising. "I don't want you to feel any obligation to this to me. Your situation is complicated enough without that, but I would be dishonest if I kept not saying it, and I'd rather be honest with you than comfortable. So I care for you, Mina, more than I would know how to measure." The street was very quiet. Somewhere a dog barked and then stopped. The lantern flame bent and straightened. She said, "I care for you too." She said it simply, because it was simple, because it had been for some time, and she had been the one adding the complications. "I have for weeks." I didn't know how to say it without it feeling like gratitude, which it partly is, but it's much more than that. "Gratitude is not what I'm looking for," he said. "I know, that's what I'm telling you." She looked at him steadily. "I came to your well and you gave me water, and you didn't ask who I was first. You gave me a room and you fed me, and you wrote to a lawyer, and you stayed in Wichita, and you never made me feel like I owed you anything for any of it, which is the most unusual thing anyone has ever done for me. But it's not why I care for you." She paused, finding the words. "I care for you because of who you are when no one is watching. The books. The way you think before you speak. The way you look at what's fair and what isn't, and you do something about it without making a speech. The way you laugh when you think something's genuinely funny and not just when you think you should. I care for you because you're real, Ralph, and I haven't had enough of that." He reached across and took her hand, which was the first time he had deliberately touched her, and she felt it travel all the way through her. He said, "Then we're in agreement." She laughed, which was not what she expected to do, but it was the right response, and he smiled, the full, unguarded version that she had only seen a few times and that she wanted to see for a very long time. They sat holding hands on the porch while the town settled into night, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It was 10 days after this, 4 weeks into their stay in Wichita, that Marshal Cooper requested another meeting. Webb was there when they arrived at the office, and his expression was composed in a way that suggested he was managing something. Cooper sat them down and said, without preamble, "There's been a development. Deputy Marshal Vane, who, I should tell you, is not an associate of this office in any professional sense that I endorse, has petitioned the federal prosecutor's office independently. He's offering you a full pardon, Miss Doyle, in exchange for the same information you have already provided to me." Mina looked at him steadily. "He's offering me a pardon. A complete pardon. All charges dismissed, record cleared. No restrictions." Cooper's expression was carefully neutral. "I want to be clear about the mechanism here. Vane believes he is going to intercept the credit for Cassidy's capture. If he can get you to sign a statement that designates him as the recipient of the information, rather than this office, he positions himself as the one who broke the Cassidy operation. It's a political matter more than a legal one, and I won't pretend it isn't messy." "What's the difference to me?" Mina asked. "If both routes end in a pardon, the difference," Webb said carefully, "is that Vane's route requires you to sign a statement that attributes the decision to cooperate to a private conversation with Vane, a conversation that, by the way, never occurred. It would essentially be a false affidavit." She understood. A pardon, but one that required her to lie, and specifically to attribute the information to Vane rather than to the path she had actually taken, which included Ralph's decision to contact Webb, Webb's decision to contact Cooper, and her own decision to tell the truth through a legitimate channel. "He wants the credit," she said. "Yes," Cooper said, "and he's offering a full pardon to get it." "I have a full pardon coming through this office regardless," she said. "Yes. Pending the final review, which I expect to be completed within 2 to 3 weeks. Vane is offering certainty now versus likelihood soon." She looked at the folded paper on Cooper's desk. She knew without touching it that it was the pardon instrument drafted by Vane's office ready to be signed. A full pardon, freedom. The record cleared. She thought about what it cost. It cost a lie. It cost attributing her choice to a man who had nothing to do with it. It cost Ralph's name on a process that would be written out of the record entirely. It cost the truth, which was something she had spent 11 months learning the value of. She picked up the paper. She did not unfold it. She held it in her hand for exactly as long as it took to be certain of herself, which was not very long at all. She handed it back. "I don't need to read it," she said. "Tell Vane no." Cooper looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. She thought he had expected this, or at least hoped for it. Webb was nodding slowly, and Ralph, beside her, made a sound that she would not have described as a word but was absolutely something. A low, quiet exhale that was the sound of a man who has just seen someone do exactly what he already believed they were capable of. "No," she said again, clearly, so there was no ambiguity. "Whatever Vane is offering, the answer is no. I've already told the truth to the right people through the right channel. I'm not going to lie about that now in exchange for anything. The pardon will come or it won't, and I'll deal with that. But I won't trade the truth for it." Cooper picked up the paper. He set it aside with finality. "I'll inform Vane's office," he said. "And for what it's worth, Miss Doyle, my recommendation to the prosecutor will be strongly worded." She thanked him and they left. On the street outside, she walked half a block before she realized her hands were shaking, which happened sometimes after she had done something that cost her, even if it was the right thing. She stopped and pressed them flat against her sides and took a breath. Ralph stopped beside her. He said gently, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I think so." She let out a breath. "I handed back a full pardon, Ralph." "I know." Reading it. "I know." He turned to face her, and his expression had that quality it sometimes had of something very large being said very quietly. "And I know what that cost you." "It didn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to give," she said. "That's what I keep reminding myself. You can't buy something real with something false, and anything I built on a lie would just be a very well-constructed nothing." She paused. "I've been in a nothing for 11 months. I don't want to go back." He reached out and took her hand on the street, in daylight, in plain view of whoever might be passing, which was not something he had done before in public, and she understood it for what it was, a declaration, a deliberate and public one. She held his hand and they walked back toward the inn, and she felt steadier with every step. The weeks that followed were full of small forward movements and long periods of waiting, which was the nature of legal processes in 1882, and which they navigated with what she came to think of as shared patience. The kind of patience that is easier when there are two of you managing it. Hector Vane appeared in Wichita once more, a week after the pardon paper was refused, and he came to the inn and asked to see her, and she met him in the front parlor with Webb present because she was not stupid. Vane was angry in the contained, cold way that she had recognized in dangerous men, not shouting, not threatening, just existing at a temperature that was slightly too warm for safety. He said that she was making a mistake and that she would regret it. She said that she understood his position and that she did not intend to change hers. He left. Webb said, afterward, "That may complicate things politically, but it will not change the outcome." Vane does not have the authority he thinks he has. Ralph said nothing, but after Vane left, he stood near the window and watched the man's departure with an expression that she had only seen twice, once with Clem prior, and once when the saddle situation had been described to him in detail. She recognized it as a particular kind of controlled anger, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that stays solidly in place and does not move for anyone. He said eventually, "He won't trouble you further," she said. "What makes you sure?" "Because men like Vane depend on their leverage and he's used his and it didn't work. Without leverage, there's nothing." He turned from the window. "He'll find another way to advance his career that doesn't involve you." She thought he was right, and he was. Vane stopped coming around. 4 weeks after the pardon paper was handed back, Marcus Webb called them to his office with the brisk energy of a man who had good news and was not bothering to hide it. The formal dismissal of charges had come through. Complete. All charges accessory to robbery, the escape charge, everything dismissed. The record cleared. She was, in the eyes of the law of the United States of America, free. She sat in Webb's office and read the document all the way through twice, because this one she was very willing to read, and when she finished the second reading, she put it down on the desk and pressed her hands flat again, which had apparently become her physical response to large things. Webb was talking about some of the legal details, the timeline, the precedent it set, and she heard him in the way you hear background music when you are in a very loud interior silence. She looked at Ralph, who was sitting beside her, and he was looking at the document with an expression of complete, uncomplicated satisfaction. He caught her eye. He said quietly, "There you are." She did not entirely understand the phrase in the moment. Later she would think about it and realize what he meant, that he was looking at her as someone who was, for the first time in more than a year, entirely herself, without charges or warrants or fugitive status layered over her. Just Wilhelmina Doyle, free and clear. She said, "There I am." Webb shook her hand and then Ralph's and said that he would send copies of the documents to her by post wherever she settled. He said that Marshal Cooper's operation against Cassidy was being mounted and that there would likely be news of it within a month or two. He said that she had done the right thing from the start, in his legal opinion. She thanked him sincerely and they walked out into the Wichita sunlight and the busy morning of Douglas Avenue, and she stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the sky, which was a high, brilliant September blue that went on forever in every direction the way only a Kansas sky does. "What do you want to do first?" Ralph said. "Send a telegram to my mother," she said immediately, "and then eat something good for breakfast, and then go back." He looked at her. "Back to the homestead." If you're..." She stopped herself trying to be careful and just said the direct thing. "I want to go back to the homestead, Ralph. I want to finish fixing that shutter on the north window, and I want to plant garlic before the first frost, and I want to look into whether the county might need a school teacher, because I heard from Webb that they're trying to establish a school board," and she stopped, because she was running ahead of herself, and she made herself slow down. "I want to go home," she said. "If that's what it is." He was looking at her with a warmth that was entirely unguarded, which was the most she had ever seen from him, and he said, "It's what it is. It's been what it is since you rode up to the well." She laughed. "I looked terrible when I rode up to the well." "You looked determined," he said. "Which I'll take over pretty any day," she said. "That is very romantic," he said. "I'm practicing." She took his hand and they walked to the telegraph office to send word to her mother in Missouri, and everything about the day felt like the first page of something. The ride back to the homestead took 2 days, and they took their time with it. stopping by streams and not rushing, and the September prairie was golden and wide, and the sky was enormous. And she rode beside him, and they talked and were quiet in equal measure, and it was very good. They stopped on the second afternoon at the crest of a low rise from which you could see the homestead below, the limestone house, the barn, the windmill, the kitchen garden needing attention, the cattle as distant dark shapes in the far grass. She stopped her horse and looked at it. "It looks like a home," she said. "It does," he agreed. "It looks like my home," she said, carefully testing the words. He turned in his saddle to look at her directly. He said, "I'd like to make that more formal if you're willing. I don't intend to rush you, and I don't intend to put conditions on anything. You can stay as long as you like and leave if you want, and I'll think no less of you for it. But I want you to know that what I want is for you to stay, permanently, as my wife, if that's a word you're interested in." She looked at him in the afternoon light, with the homestead below them and the Kansas sky enormous above, and she thought about everything that had led to this. The broken saddle, the well, the eggs and cornbread, the letter from her mother, Clem Pryor, in the garden, the bookshop, the porch and the lantern and his hand covering hers, the pardon paper that she had handed back without reading, because the truth was worth more than the easy thing. She thought about the man in front of her, who had given her water and a room and a lawyer and 3 weeks in Wichita and his hand on a public street and the most careful, honest, unperforming love she had ever seen expressed in a human life. She said, "Yes, that's a word I'm very interested in." He let out a breath that was all relief and no surprise. And then he smiled, the full, unguarded version that she had promised herself she would see more of. They rode down to the homestead. The garlic was planted before the first frost, because she kept her word on things like that. The north shutter was fixed. She wrote to the county school board and had a response by December that suggested a strong likelihood of appointment for the following school year, pending the formation of a formal board and the funding of a schoolhouse, which was promised to be completed by spring. She wrote to her mother in Missouri, long letters that she had been writing in her head for months, and that now came out in long, warm paragraphs about the homestead and the prairie and a man named Ralph Trask. And her mother wrote back with practical questions and quietly expressed happiness. They were married in Caldwell in November of 1882, which was a choice that had a certain symmetry to it. The town where Hector Vane had announced her as a criminal was the town where she married Ralph Trask in the small Methodist church on the east end of the main street, with the minister who also served the 3 nearest counties, and Marcus Webb, who had ridden down from Wichita, and Ralph's neighboring rancher Gus Henley and his wife Dora, who had been looking after the cattle, and who brought a wedding cake that was heavy with dried fruit and completely delicious. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Ralph had bought in Wichita, a deep blue wool that was appropriate for November, and that she had cut and sewn in the evenings over the previous 3 weeks, while he read aloud to her from the Dickens novels, which had turned out to be a habit she intended to maintain. The minister said the words, and Ralph put on her finger a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother, which he had been carrying in his shirt pocket since they rode back from Wichita, which she learned only when he produced it in the church. And she had to take a moment, because that detail, that he had been carrying it, was the kind of quiet certainty about him that she found entirely overwhelming. She said the words clearly and meant every syllable. He said the words looking at her steadily, the way he looked at everything that mattered. Marcus Webb said afterward that he had attended a good number of legal proceedings in his career, and that this was his favorite. Gus Henley said that Ralph had needed someone for a long time, and he was glad it had worked out. Dora Henley hugged Mina and told her the garlic in the kitchen garden had been planted correctly, and that was a very good sign, which Mina thought was probably the most useful wedding compliment she received. They drove back to the homestead in the early dark, the winter stars very clear and very close, and the windmill turning in the cold December air, and the cattle settled for the night, and the house warm with the fire Ralph had banked before they left that morning. She stood in the kitchen of the stone house and looked at the firelight and the shelf of books and the two chairs at the table and the window that showed the dark prairie outside, and she felt the wholeness of it in a way that was simple and complete and real. He came to stand beside her, and his arm went around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, which was the most natural thing she had ever done. She said, "I want to read to you tonight." He said, "What did you have in mind?" She considered. "Whitman," she said. "The Road poem. Good choice," he said. She read to him by the fire until the cold outside pressed itself against the windows, and the fire needed building up, and then he put more wood on and she kept reading, and the prairie dark settled all around the limestone house, and the windmill turned and turned. The winter of 1882 moving into 1883 was cold and honest, which was the way she had come to think about the good things in her life, honest as a quality of character, applicable to seasons and people alike. She taught herself the workings of the homestead more thoroughly than she had in the summer, learning the particular needs of the cattle, and the way the property managed water, and the temperament of the horses, which she had always been good with. She and Ralph worked well together in the easy, practical way of two people who respected each other's competence and did not get in each other's way. News came in January that the U.S. Marshal's operation had resulted in the capture of Eli Cassidy and 6 members of his gang at the Canyon Camp west of Cimarron. Her information, provided through Cooper's office 4 months earlier, had been exactly accurate. The Canyon South Trail, the supply approach, the layout she had described, all of it had enabled a clean and largely unviolent arrest in early January when the gang was settled in for the winter. Cassidy was in federal custody. He was going to trial. She read the letter from Webb that carried this news sitting at the kitchen table on a gray January morning, with snow on the ground outside and Ralph across from her eating breakfast. When she looked up, he was watching her. She said, "Cassidy's been taken." He was still. The Canyon, January, Cooper's men. She put the letter on the table. "It's done." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He said, "You did that." "We did that," she said. "You wrote to Webb. You made the choice to tell the truth," he said. "More than once, and the second time was harder." She thought about the pardon paper, unread, handed back. The full pardon, the easy exit, given back without so much as opening it because the truth had been worth more than the convenience. She had not second-guessed it in the months since, and she did not now, and she thought that not second-guessing it was the best possible confirmation that she had gotten it right. She said, "I wonder sometimes what would have happened if the saddle hadn't broken." "I think you'd have found another way," he said. "Eventually. Maybe." She looked at their hands. "But it wouldn't have been this." "No," he agreed, and his hand tightened slightly on hers. "It wouldn't have been this." Clem Pryor, she learned in the spring from a passing newspaper account, had given testimony against Cassidy in exchange for reduced charges, and had relocated somewhere in Colorado, which was a piece of information she received with a complicated feeling. A relief that Cassidy's enterprise was thoroughly dismantled, a wary respect for Clem's self-preserving pragmatism, and a small, private gratitude that he had told Cassidy he hadn't found her, in that moment in the garden, when he could have done otherwise. The school appointment came through in April of 1883. The county had funded a schoolhouse to be built 3 miles from the homestead, not 12 miles, because she had argued with the board that the further distance was not reasonable for younger children, and she was to begin teaching that fall. The schoolhouse was a simple frame building with a proper stove and long windows and bench desks, and she walked through it when it was finished in August and felt, in the empty room with its smell of new wood and chalk, exactly the thing she had wanted to feel since she was old enough to know what she wanted. She taught 22 students that first year, ranging from 6 to 15, in the one-room format that was standard for the territory. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic and some history, and as much of the wider world as she could fit into the school day, because she believed in the Whitman idea that the road opened wider the more you knew about where it went. She was a good teacher, patient with confusion, and demanding about effort and genuinely interested in what her students thought, which was something children recognized and responded to. Ralph came to the school on the first day to fix a hinge on the door that hadn't been hung properly, and he stayed to watch her handle the first hour of class. And when she caught his eye through the window, he had that expression she loved, the warm, steady, completely unguarded one, and she had to look quickly back at her students before she lost her composure. The spring of 1884 brought a letter from her mother that included the news that her mother was going to come visit. Mina read this letter with a mixture of joy and a very specific kind of nerves that she had never expected to feel at 26, which was the nerves of introducing your husband to your mother, who had formed strong opinions about men over a long life. Her mother, Wilhelmina Doyle, arrived on the afternoon train to Caldwell in May, and Ralph drove the wagon to collect her, and Mina waited at the homestead and tried not to watch the road too anxiously. When the wagon appeared, she walked out to meet it, and her mother stepped down with the careful dignity of a woman in her 50s who did everything with precision, and they held each other for a long time. Wilhelmina Doyle looked at the homestead with a farmer's eye and said it was well maintained. She looked at the kitchen garden and said the garlic was the right variety for this soil. She looked at the shelf of books and said she was glad to know her daughter had married a man who read. And she looked at Ralph Trask with the focused, direct assessment of a woman who had spent 58 years learning to read people accurately, and after a long moment she said, "You are a good man." Ralph said, "I try to be." Wilhelmina said, "My daughter deserves someone who does more than try. From what she has written to me, you do more than try." She paused. "I approve." Which, knowing Mina, she will tell you she doesn't need, but I'm telling you anyway. Mina said, "I don't need it." Wilhelmina said, "I know. I'm telling him anyway." Ralph looked at Mina with the expression that she thought of as his truest one, the one that showed everything he was thinking without any filter between the inside and the outside, and she thought that her mother was right. She didn't need the approval, but she was very glad to have it. Wilhelmina stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time she and Ralph developed a mutual respect that was characteristic of both of them, not effusive, not performed, but genuine and durable. She taught Mina 2 recipes she had been meaning to pass on for years and helped repair the kitchen garden south border where the soil had been washing out in rain. And on her last evening she sat on the porch with them and watched the prairie sunset do its extravagant business and said, without preface, "Thomas would have liked this." The name landed with the weight it always carried. Thomas, who was gone. Thomas, whose debt had set everything in motion, who would never know that the chain he had inadvertently started had led to this house and this man and this life. Mina said, yes, he would have. They were quiet together on the porch, her mother, her husband, and herself, and the sunset finished its performance and the first stars appeared, and the windmill turned, and it was a moment she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Hector Vane had been removed from his position as deputy marshal in the spring of 1883. She learned through Webb, following a review of his conduct that had been initiated partly because of the unauthorized pardon maneuver he had attempted. He had opened a land office somewhere in the Oklahoma Territory, which struck her as exactly the sort of career transition a man like Vane would make, and which took him far enough out of her life that she stopped thinking about him within a few weeks. He was the kind of man who had never truly seen her, and she found she had no particular feeling about him now except a mild and vague pity. The second year of her teaching brought a waiting list for the school, which meant the county needed to think about expanding, and she wrote a report to the school board about enrollment trends and building capacity that was thorough and persuasive, and resulted in the board agreeing to add a second room to the schoolhouse by the following fall. The board chairman said she was the most organized person he had worked with in 20 years of county administration. She took this as a professional compliment, and also, privately, as confirmation that her mother's talent for organization had not skipped a generation. She and Ralph had by now settled into the rhythms of a shared life, in the particular way that happens when two people are genuinely suited to each other, not without friction. Because friction was part of any honest life, but with the kind of friction that was productive rather than corrosive, that produced understanding rather than distance. They argued occasionally, usually about the relative importance of fixing various things on the homestead versus spending time on projects she considered higher priority. And these arguments were always resolved because they were both, at their core, reasonable people who respected each other enough to hear the other side out. One evening in the fall of 1884, after the school was well into its second year, and the cattle were being moved south for the winter grazing, and the homestead was settling into its cold season routines, she found Ralph sitting on the porch reading by lantern light with the Whitman collection she had bought in Wichita, which had become, by an organic and unplanned process, a book they both claimed. She sat on the step and said, "You're reading my book," he said without looking up. "It's my book, too." She said, "The inscription says Mina Doyle, Wichita, September 1882. He said, "Mina Trask, and that was before you knew." She laughed. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked up then. She was looking at the prairie and she could feel him looking at her, and she said, "We're going to have a child, I expect in the spring." The silence that followed was maybe 5 seconds, which she counted approximately while looking at the dark grass and the stars. He set the book down. He said, "Come here." She turned and he was reaching for her, and she moved toward him, and he held her with the entirety of the certainty he had about everything he cared about, which was absolute. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him breathe. He said against her hair, "Spring." "April, I think," she said. He said, "The schoolhouse will need a substitute." She laughed. "I have already thought about this. Mrs. Henley was a teacher in Ohio. She'd be willing for a term." "You've already asked Dora Henley." "I asked her last week. I wanted to have the arrangements in order before I told you because I knew you would worry about the school." He pulled back enough to look at her. "I would worry about you." "I know," she said. "I knew that too, and I am going to be fine." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know you are," and then more quietly, "I know." The spring of 1885 gave them a boy. He was born on a Thursday in early April, healthy and loud, with Ralph's dark hair and her stubborn jaw, and they named him Thomas James Trask, for her brother and for Ralph's father, which felt like the right way to bring people forward who couldn't be there. Mina looked at her son in her arms and felt a love that was entirely new in its specific quality, the fierce, foundational, overwhelming love of a mother, which she had known intellectually was real, and which she discovered was immeasurably more real than she had imagined. She looked from Thomas to Ralph, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with the carefully restrained expression of a man trying very hard not to show how moved he was and failing entirely, and she said, "He has your hair." Ralph said, voice rough, "He has your expression already. He's an hour old." "Still," she said, "Ralph." He looked at her. She said, "Thank you for all of it, for the water first and then everything after." He reached over and put his hand on the side of her face, gentle and careful. He said, "Thank you for riding up to that well." Thomas James Trask grew into a healthy, bright, deeply curious boy who could ride a horse before he was 4, and who treated the school's library, such as it was, by then a proper collection of 50 volumes, as his personal territory. He was followed in the spring of 1887 by a sister, Margaret Aliner, named for Ralph's mother and for Mina's, who was a smaller and more deliberate version of her brother, and who had, from her earliest months, a way of observing the world that suggested she was filing everything away for future use. By the time Margaret Aliner arrived, the homestead had been expanded, a new wing added to the limestone house, the barn rebuilt properly, a second well. The school had its second room and a second teacher, a young woman fresh from normal school in Kansas City, whom Mina supervised with the kind of supportive firmness she wished she had had access to at 20. The county had given the school formal district status, which meant proper funding and a real salary, and Mina had been elected to the district board, which was not a thing a woman was commonly elected to in 1887 Kansas. But the parents of the children she had taught for 4 years were not much interested in what was commonly done when they had a clear picture of what worked. She remembered sometimes the morning she had ridden to Ralph's well, the rope on her wrists, the red-burned skin, the terror and exhaustion and the resolution not to show it. She remembered the way he had walked her to the well without asking first who she was. She remembered the coffee that morning and the eggs and the feeling of something loosening in her chest. She thought about the pardon paper sometimes too. The unread document, handed back without ceremony. She had never regretted it for a single day. She understood, in the way you understand things that have been tested and proven, that there are some things worth more than the easy exit, that a life built on the truth of what happened, even when the truth is complicated and the easy thing is right there within reach, is worth infinitely more than a life built on the expedient version. She had handed back the paper and she had gotten something much better herself, intact, and the life she was living now, which was real in every direction. On an evening in the fall of 1888, 6 years from the August morning she had ridden to Ralph's well, she sat on the porch of the expanded limestone house and watched her children play in the yard. Thomas was 3.5 years old in personality, if not in calendar years, serious about some things and wildly enthusiastic about others. And Margaret was 1 year and some months, and was sitting in the dirt observing a beetle with the focused attention of a future naturalist. The windmill was turning in the evening breeze. The cattle were in the far pasture. The kitchen garden was harvested and put to bed for winter, the garlic planted for next spring, as it had been every fall since her first October here. Ralph came out of the house and sat in the chair beside her, and she heard him sigh, the long, satisfied exhalation of a man at the end of a day's work that was done and done well. She said, "Long day." "Good day," he said. She looked at him. He was 38 now, and the years had added some lines to his face and more gray at the temples, and he was, she thought, more himself with each passing year, more settled into what he had always been, which was honest and steady and capable and good. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. She said, "I was thinking about how I found you." "You didn't find me," he said. "You rode to my well looking like you'd had a considerable week." "I found you," she said. "The well was the mechanism, but I found you." He smiled, the full, unguarded version that she had been seeing for 6 years now and that still had the effect on her that it always had. He said, "I suppose that's one way to look at it." "It's the correct way," she said. "From the woman who handed a full pardon back without reading it," he said. "I'll take your word on what's correct." She laughed. Margaret looked up from her beetle at the sound and then went back to her investigation, satisfied. Thomas came running across the yard with a stone he considered remarkable and climbed onto the porch to show his father, and Ralph received the stone with the seriousness it deserved and examined it carefully, and said it was a very good stone, which was precisely the right answer. The prairie evening settled around them gold and wide and permanent, and the windmill turned, and the cattle moved in the far distance, and the first star appeared above the eastern horizon, faint and certain. She reached over and put her hand on top of his, which was resting on the arm of his chair, and his hand turned under hers and held on. She thought about her mother's last visit, when Alina had said that Thomas would have liked this, and she thought that he would have. She thought about the road poem, and the idea that the road could be yours, and she thought that the road had brought her here by such a strange and painful and improbable path. Through her brother's debt and Cassidy's coercion and Hector Vane's rope, and a broken saddle horn, and a well in the Kansas grassland, and a man who gave her water without asking who she was first. She thought about the pardon paper, and what she had been thinking in the moment she held it. She had been thinking that the paper was offering her freedom as if she didn't already have it, as if freedom were something you were granted by men with paper, rather than something you claimed by being honest about who you were and what you valued. She had handed it back because she already had everything it was offering, and she had earned it without lying, and she was not going to trade the truth of that for a document. She had been right. She knew that now with the clarity of 6 years' evidence. She had been completely and entirely right, and the life she was living was the proof of it. This house, these children, this man beside her, this evening, this windmill turning in the Kansas air. Ralph said quietly, "What are you thinking?" She considered it. The true and full answer was complex and would take longer than an evening porch conversation to say completely. But some of it was simple. She said, "That I'm exactly where I want to be." He looked at her in the evening light. He said, "Me too." Thomas ran back into the yard. Margaret discovered something new about her beetle. The star above the horizon brightened as the sky darkened. The windmill turned and turned and turned. And on the porch of the limestone house on the Kansas shortgrass prairie, Wilhelmina Trask, who had been Wilhelmina Doyle when she rode up to a well with burned wrists, and nothing but the clothes on her back and the stubbornness her father had called determination, held her husband's hand and watched the stars come out, one by one, over the enormous, honest, open dark, and she was free.